Hello, everyone. Welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea Podcast Record Club, where each of us pick a record every week. And this week, we are reviewing Morgan's recommended album, which is Julia Holter's massive Aviary. Morgan, why'd you pick this fine thick woman to review?
Excuse you. Throw some respect on her name.
I was talking about the album, not Miss Holter, but
fucking hell. So I chose Julia Holter's Aviary this week simply because there is absolutely nothing like it. And that is pretty much inherently going to make for interesting conversation.
Reason enough.
Absolutely. And you guys, I mean, all three of us are big Julia Holter fans. And you guys, So like, what is it about Julia that you guys love? And what is it about this record that I think that makes it so exciting?
Because it sounds like Baroque pop composed by a fucking insane person.
It's like, at points it barely even sounds like, and Baroque pop is already kind of a wide umbrella term. At points this resembles jazz fusion more than it does Baroque pop.
Yeah. I think Julia's always been a really compelling and fascinating and interesting and original artist her entire career, going all the way back to Ecstasis. But I think she really particularly came into her own on Loud City Song, where she developed this, again, nocturnal and gloomy, but frequently beautiful sound that she explored in ways that were sometimes lush and pretty and enveloping, and other times like coldly strange and dissonant and weird. And she has always loved playing with texture and the emotional power of texture and the emotional variability of texture, not without trying to be too vague here, but she does explore, I think, the effect of different instruments and sounds in combination to create something that is sublime. And that's something that she honed, I think, to more, I'll say, focused song structures on Have You in My Wilderness, her 2015 album that really, I think, stands for a lot of people as kind of a high watermark record. It's a record that's grown on me a lot.
Favorite.
It's a record that's grown on me a lot as I've returned to it. Has some of her most immediate, hard-hitting songs like Feel You and Sea Calls Me Home, like songs that just kind of like immediately wriggle their way into your head and have that kind of trademark strangeness in their composition, but are never too like alienating. Whereas
I would describe it as like the Hounds of Love of 2010s music.
Yeah,
I think that's a cool reference point. And obviously Kate Bush is super influential, even if abstractly, on Julia Holter. Just this whole notion of this pop voice or pop friendly voice, but leaning into the avant-garde side of those things and pulling them forward into these really beguiling structures that
they're also both share the commonality of being insane women who make big music. This is like, it doesn't line up like release wise, but this is like Kate Bush did The Dreaming and then did Hounds of Love. Well, Julia Holter did that in reverse, and this conversely is her The Dreaming, in my opinion anyway.
It's like her The Dreaming in energy, but it's her Aerial in like structure, because it's like this two-part double LP that stretches for like an hour and a half. And I mean, where to begin like unpacking it? I last night when I was listening to this for like the fucking 7th or 6th time this week, I went on to, she did a Tim's Twitter listening party of this album a couple of years ago. I don't know if you guys know what that is, but like they Tim Burgess, I think it is, hosts these listening parties of the record, and often the artist will join the listening party on Twitter and actually tweet about each song. And so Julia did this in 2020 during the lockdown. And the cool thing about the Tim's Twitter listening parties is that you can go onto Tim's website and replay the listening party and sync up the album so that all the tweets from Julia appear at the exact moment in the album that she tweeted them while you were listening to it. So I did that, and just to try and see if I could get any insights from Julia about this record. And her tweets were all just like, sometimes they were really insightful about like the performers and the approach and the sound design, construction, technical side of things. Most of the time, it was just Julia losing her mind on Twitter, trying to describe her process, and just because it can't be easily described in this like, well, I'm trying to do this and exploring this. It's very kind of like just like feeling and sensation, and not like intellectualization at all with Julia. It's just like put this feeling into the music. And sometimes it's like just exploring language for the sake of it, or just exploring how sounds sound together for the sake of it, and just exploring contrast between vocals and instruments. Like how does this horn line sound against this kind of bedrock of synths, or how does this piano part sound with this kind of like layered distortion bass over top of it? How does this MIDI preset sound pushed up against this real double bass that's also happening? Like all of these kinds of things that Julia is exploring for the sake of it to a certain extent, and to create a atmosphere and a vibe that puts you into her head. And it's not a matter of trying to like do something like heady and conceptual, although maybe, I don't know, it just, my perception of it is it's more just about emotion and feeling and sensation and living in a weird way. Like it's very hard to try and convey, I think, what she's trying to do without getting all flowery with it and shit. But thankfully, there's enough happening here that you can talk about and describe what's happening musically and never run out of things to say as well, because this is an album that's always doing shit. Like musically, shit is always fucking happening on this album, and it's like a trip. It's just like it's, and what I mean by all of this is that it's not just, hey, there's a cool like, you know, melody that's happening, or hey, that's a cool sound that's happening. But what's beautiful about Julia's music, and this record in particular, is that it's a fucking tapestry of sound almost always. It's never just one thing that's happening. It's very seldom that one thing is happening. Almost always you're having collisions of different instrumentation. You're having collisions of sound. You're having collisions of textures. Sometimes they're rich and harmonious and it makes you feel fucking transcendent joy. And sometimes they're like so dissonant that it makes you feel like fucking terrified and unnerved. Often those two things can be within the exact same song. And so you're never bored. You're never lost for things to grip onto. Your brain is always engaged. Your mind is always kind of like reacting against some combination of things. I mean, the points on this record where Julia does get more minimal and slowed down, like the closing track, Why Sad Song, for instance, or one of earlier parts of songs like In Garden's Darkness, or like moments, the rare moments on this record where you have a real quiet passage, are almost disarming, because they are like these beautiful reprieves from the chaos that surrounds them, and then they often just become chaotic. Sometimes you'll have a chaotic passage happening and then it will just empty into silence and something new will start happening. So it's difficult to even describe, like, or even try to describe, I think, what Julia might possibly be going for, other than to just, again, throw you into these different states of mind and see what happens. And the challenge for me, and I guess the challenge for us, is to try and describe why that works and isn't just a total formless mess. And I'm going to try my best to do that, I guess. But this album is totally chaotic, and it is all the more masterful for that somehow. I don't know how she does it, but it is such a rich voyage of sound. And I don't know, how would you guys try and describe the sound of this album?
See, that's the thing. I don't really think it, I mean, it's silly to say such a superlative thing, but I feel like even like a paragraph. There just mathematically aren't enough words to be able to do the 82 minutes here worth of justice. But like, I think the best way to relay what her music is like is that above all else, I think Julia is first and foremost a composer. I think that the construction of her songs is basically the bread and butter, what they live and what they die by. It's not necessarily the only thing that matters, not by a long shot, but to me anyway, it's that she is so, like, she as a lyricist has always been really compelling to me, mainly because, as I alluded to earlier, she's a fucking psychopath. I say so endearingly. Mainly just because, like, you listen to Have You in My Wilderness with no context, and you're just like, this woman is saying words, and eventually you just have to understand that her word choices are, to me anyway, they're impressionist, but they also have heavily to do with, is what Tyler said, with his texture, is that she's using her voice as the instrument really more so than anything else. She has an incredibly lovely voice. That's why like, for all of this big lofty superlative language we can use to describe her music, it's why I can recommend it to so many people, is that, like, just from a raw aesthetic perspective, she makes very gorgeous sounding things. And the way she uses lyricism is often kind of weird and esoteric, but that's also the way she uses her structures. It's the way that she constructs, like, I don't really understand how I can break down some of these songs just because they don't really adhere to any traditional song structure. Sometimes they can be like one of the most standout moments on here to me is the song Every Day is an Emergency, is because for about 3/4 of this song, it's like the same idea over and over again, except it builds and builds and builds. And then the final 25% of the song is like a complete blowback, a complete, like, it's like the music is responding to itself and then like pushing it away like a tide.
Yeah.
The way it feels like she's channeling something otherworldly and like conducting it. And for me anyway, it's the moments on this album that work the most, not to imply that they're like moments that don't work on this, because I kind of had a journey with this, is that I've loved Julia's music for a really long time. And I've loved this album for a really long time. It's been like my second favorite of hers. I said Have You in My Wilderness was my favorite, but it's a bit more tenuous now, just because I've needed an excuse to absorb this. And I'm glad Morgan recommended it, because it gave me that excuse, is because the first impression I have of this album is just like, I loved all of that, but also that's a lot of fucking music. So you just kind of need to sit back and you need to, like, not even take notes. You just need to absorb each and every song, and maybe even another listen to absorb it as all one continuously flowing piece, which thankfully I did do. Not to imply I didn't listen to it in one sitting. It's just that I more absorbed the things that leapt out at me at first, like I do with most of her music. But with this, getting to know and understand what each song does and what each song accomplishes, and sort of waiting for it, like, it makes this feel very tense. And I don't mean that in an anxious way. I mean that in an exciting way, is that every single part of every single song feels like it is building to something. And when you get to that something, that's when this album goes from beautiful and good and well put together to an experience that I could only, like, Julia Holter is like the Terrence Malick of music. This bitch can just harness pure raw sounds that are so enrapturing that I could give less of a fuck what some of these lyrics could be saying. And I don't say that dismissively. I'm just saying that she knows how to put together something that is so fundamentally gorgeous that it just overwhelms you and becomes its own brand of artistic accessibility. And there are moments on here where it just soars. For me, I love every song here, but the first time the album does that for me is on is it Kaitius? Kaitius, is that how you pronounce this?
Kaitius, I think something like that.
Yeah. The first two songs I think are great exercises in what Julia traditionally does. This song, however, is when the album first, this feels like something that even she hasn't like charted in terms of like her artistic oeuvre thus far, and it becomes pure otherworldly ephemera that just completely absorbs you from start to finish. And that's like half the songs on here. The density of these compositions is just fucking staggering. Like we compared it to Kate Bush. I think the closest thing I could compare it to is actually the second half of Hounds of Love, which is a like very pure like concept piece that I feel is super analogous to this moment's most esoteric but also most compelling moments.
Mm-hmm.
And oh man, it's all it's so good. I risk just spouting nonsense just because this is so difficult to convey with words that it's, again, this brings back one of our former member Serge's favorite phrases, which is talking about music is like dancing about architecture. And frankly, this is the most emblematic of that statement that it could possibly be.
Yeah, I do completely agree. I do think, though, I purposefully took the time to write down thoughts on songs, like just little things that I like about songs, like little details that I like, because there's so many of them and they occur in every single song. And I think even if we're to zero in on the song you mentioned, Every Day is an Emergency, which is a song that actually I think that is one of the few songs that Julia spoke about in a way that I understood when I was following her. Which is that it's kind of a piece. I mean, it's right there in the title. Like, it's kind of a piece meant to convey the state of mind of being for Julia at the time she was making this record. Just existing in a hell world, basically. And I like the way that
play Anxiety by Jason Isbell.
I just like fucking the first half of this song, Colin Stetson, you're fucking nothing, retire.
Yeah, right? It's like a fucking, this has the same effect as like hearing an alarm sound effect in a movie where your spine just kind of tingles and you're like, oh no, don't do that's the entire
I say this with the utmost respect, and it's a compliment, but also, hey, you want to hear the most annoying sound in the world?
What I love about it is, or what I think is interesting about it, rather, because I do love it, that the thing is, the first 4 minutes of this track are a three-way duel between three different instruments, a violin, a trumpet, and a bagpipe. And in fact, the bagpipe, which is played on this record by the fantastic Tashi Wada, figures very heavily across this entire record. And you have, in the first 4 minutes of this song, this absolute duel that's happening between those three instruments fighting each other. A lot of the parts of this record, I think, were recorded sort of separately. There are some parts of the record that were recorded kind of with the bands that are playing together, but there are other parts of the record where instrumentation was recorded kind of individually, as you typically kind of would for an album. But I think Julia insisted that this three-way duel had to be kind of recorded all at once so that the players could actually respond to each other in real time. And you can hear some of that in the way that certain players intensify, then recede and respond to each other. And it's just this absolute cacophony of sound, essentially. And it feels like
the jazz influence there feels really strong. I mean, it feels like you're listening to fucking Coltrane by way of Kate Bush.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like, Coltrane at his most, I guess, avant-garde, managed to make the saxophone sound like a fucking bagpipe. Like, he would make that, take what was traditionally a kind of lush and full-bodied and heavy and hefty sound and just be able to twist it into something kind of horrifying and shrieking. And the bagpipe, which I think is a very beautiful and versatile instrument, which incidentally, if you were to take the whole of this record, it's a beautiful showcase of that instrument and all of its possibilities. But it's here, it appears that it's most kind of like contorted and violent. And I love the fact that a lot of the instrumentation on this record doesn't necessarily require a shit ton of effects to acquire the effect that it has. It's just the players on this record are able to have the versatility to maneuver and manipulate their instruments to create different moods across this whole album. And this is a good point to shout out this band, because all of this record is a record where certain instruments like the bagpipe, like the trumpet, like the double bass, like the piano, and other things that I'm probably forgetting, are not just things that show up occasionally, but are heavily embedded into most, if not all, of the songs. This is a record produced with a band that were led by Holter, but infuse a lot of their own personality into these songs. Specific players like the violinists Andrew Thole and Dina Maccabee, which I'll come back to when I talk about a certain song later in the record. The double bass player Devin Hoff, whose work is integral to the fabric of a lot of these compositions. The tactile heft that the bass has in this album is so crucial. The trumpet work is gorgeous and thrilling and very varied in texture, and a lot of the other instrumentation, including the piano, the synthesizers, a lot of the other instrumentation is actually played by Julia herself, who is a multi-talented instrumentalist. And each song feels like it has either a different instrumental highlight or a different kind of combination of instrumentals and that highlight the song. And some songs just completely change within themselves. I think that one way in which the record kind of sets you up to expect this kind of like collision of instrumentation is with the opening track, Turn the Light On, which a person on Rate You Music who I follow described as an atomic bomb of spiritual jazz. And it's like, it's a complete obliteration of sound. Like, you put this album on, this song starts, and it doesn't fuck around either. You're straight away into this just galaxy of fucking everything is happening. It's like mind altering.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to put this album as an experience, is to just, most succinctly anyway, is to just say that Julia Holter's brain is fucking titanic, and this is like just dancing around in it for an hour and a half, and there is like no better way to kick that off than with Turn the Light On, which is just like, I'm not on enough acid.
It makes you feel like anytime you're not listening to this song, you are shrouded in darkness, and the only time you can actually see anything is when this album is on.
Yeah, it's just like the perfect opener, because not only does it grab you straight away, it primes you for the rest of the album, because it's throwing all of this sound at you. And every time you listen to it, you can focus in on a different instrument that's just kind of going to 100, including Julia's voice, which incidentally, she's always had a great voice, but wow, the shit she does with her voice on this album, she really reaches. She really pushes herself. She has such range across this record. She does so many amazing things. The climax of I Shall Love 2, for instance, both I Shall Love parts, the way that she kind of uses her voice to just scale to these skyscraping heights is stunning. And then she'll come down on other parts of the record to this kind of whisper where she's kind of inviting you in and leaning into the mic and going like toy and shit like that, and yeah, so she's doing so much shit with her voice, but it's not even just what she's doing with her voice and what the instrumental players are doing. It's also the studio is as a huge part of this record as well. And the production process, there's parts where her voice or other instrumentation is chopped up or twisted or made to sound really, really unusual. For instance, that part in the middle of Voce Seymour where her voice just gets chopped up going Voce, 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 and or like the absolute fucking clusterfuck that is Le Jeu to You, which is just an absolute mind melter of a track that actually took me a long time to adjust to, because when that song goes nuts and just like all of this squelching happens, like her vocals get kind of twisted and mangled, and it's like so jarring that it's really difficult to process. And so you have those moments next to these moments where they're just so stately and precious and tiny, and this is like a land of contrast. Like it feels like when you listen to this, you're hearing every possible sound at some point.
It sounds like you're playing every Bjork album at the same time.
It's like, dude, what's happening? I mean, even when you go from Turn the Light On, which is, like I said, beautiful, radiant, amazing, transcendental, into Weather, which starts off with these kind of like stabbing organs that are just so like dissonant and ugly sounding. And then like the rest of the song just builds around it. There's shades of like Animal Collective and the weird vocals that are happening in this track.
Yeah.
There's like, again, that trumpet shining through, which is incidentally courtesy of Sarah Bell Reid, who's always brilliant trumpet playing. The bagpipes come in too from Tashiwada. As I said, like this song is like, it's crazy to me. This track was a single, I think. And it's like not even 3 minutes long. And it's just fucking nuts. Like it's like so unfriendly, but also at the same time, like it pulls you in and it grabs you and it holds onto you. It's assaultive even.
I mean, the best way to describe this, honestly, is this is the most maximal musical experience I've ever had.
Yeah.
There's no album or experience I've had with art where it's just like the sheer amount of different instruments, the way that each of them is produced, the way that the structure is utilized. It's like every single aspect that something, in every single way that this can be an album of music, it is modified to the nth possible degree, to a degree like fucking progressive rock musicians throughout the last 60 years could only hope to accomplish something this fucking blitzkrieg of maximalism.
100%. But what works about it as a 90-minute album experience, right, is that it has a great sort of sense of ebb and flow and structure, right? So yeah, you're bombarded for the first two tracks, right? But then you go into Caiadius and Voce Seymour, which Caiadius is a land of contrast in and of itself. Like it's beautifully soft at certain points, and then it's just nuts at other points. Voce Seymour is much more moody and down tempo, which the record really needs at that point.
Yeah,
and
you need to slow down.
Yeah, and that, again, amazing double bass work from Devon Hoff is really present on Caiadius. It is like the backbone of the song. And again, the weird production decisions, like the moments in this track where like it feels like Julia's been sucked into a vacuum and you're just hearing her voice like completely in negative space, and then the song will come in again and it will like erupt. Like there's a part about 6.5 minutes into Caiadius where the song just kind of like blossoms into this glorious, splendid climax that is like so unreal. And then I mentioned Sarah Bell Reid's trumpet work, the way that she kind of wanders around Voce Seymour. She's kind of like just decorating the song, like gently playing. You have, I can't believe I haven't even mentioned the harp. There's so much great harp work on this record as well. Like I think there's a moment, like it's difficult to say there's any kind of soloing from any of these instruments like you would typically have on a jazz record, because they're always happening together. There's very seldom just one instrument playing in a sort of solo fashion. But I think there is like a stretch of Voce Seymour that could be called, in my opinion, a harp solo, which is just fucking cool. Like it's just fucking awesome. Joanna Newsom type beat. Like this record reminds me of Joanna Newsom a lot, specifically Have One On Me, which is her big triple album opus that this shares a lot of spiritual DNA with, I think. And yeah, so there's all of that shit is fucking unreal. I've talked about Every Day as an Emergency, which again, like that, I've talked about that first half of that track, which is fucking nuts. And then the second half, I love how the second half of the song starts out as like this starkly muted like contrast to all that noise, but it builds slowly again to end in a place that's just as unsettling as where it started, but in a different way. Like you have
mildly terrifying.
You have this like rumbling double bass drone. Like it's almost like Devon is bowing his bass strings at certain points, and they're just kind of like vibrating. You have this constant wash of like white noise on the vocals that like sparkles, and it just all grows more and more intense in a really subtle way. And then it gives way to one of my favorite songs on this record, which is called Another Dream.
My favorite Julia Holter song, period.
Another Dream is your favorite Julia Holter song?
Yes.
Shit, yes. That's such a fucking love it.
And I fucking love it so much.
The two words, and then I'm going to back off after this and let you guys talk about the first half of the record. But two words. I just want to talk about the song first. Moog synthesizer.
And I just have one word, and this is from the mouth of the woman herself, so I feel confident in this. Vangelis.
Yes. Yes.
Oh,
yes.
God, that's such a
two other words. Comparison. Blade Runner.
The Moog synthesizer work, which again I have to emphasize, is played by Julia on this song. Is like, it's like a celebration of the synthesizer and of all of its roots, but particularly obviously the Vangelis and all of the kind of classical sort of 70s users of the Moog and of synthesizers in general. It's like a gorgeous tribute to them, and it is some of the most unique and captivating I've heard a Moog sound since like the fusion records of the 70s, like Herbie Hancock records, where he was starting to incorporate synthesizers in really unique ways. Like, this song is utterly amazing. The synthesizer sounds are gorgeous. They're never like two-dimensional. They're like gorgeous, pillowy, rich in the way you would expect synths to sound, but they're also wild and boisterous. They remind you that synths are not just this texture that's thrown in to add atmosphere, but they can actually be an instrument with character. With character, right? Because the synths sound playful and boisterous, and they're jumping around. It's all in Julia. It shows you that this is an instrument that can be soloed in the same way that fucking saxophone can be, and it can have that sort of versatility. She brings fire to the synthesizer. The melody that she finds is delightful, like the way she matches it with her vocal and the "you could maybe take a moment," like that sort of shit is so like it's so fucking like just satisfying. Julia's approach to melody across this album actually is fascinating. She does this thing where she will have moments of conventional melody that are like stunning, and then she'll just back away from them, and then she'll come back at them again from a slanted angle. She treats composition like a dance on this album, almost, where it's a kind of to and fro between one idea and a different idea, and then back again to a similar idea but in a slanted way, if that makes any sense. Like, she has the compositions and the song structures on this album are never really repetitive. They're always kind of moving in different directions, or backing to where they came from, or going back to a direction in a different way by adding a new piece of instrumentation, by modifying the melody, by changing something in some way. And so it means the result of that is that these compositions are never boring. They're never too simple. They're never too repetitive. And they are always throwing you for a loop. And that's part of the reason why this is such a difficult album to wrap your head around, because and this is why I've been listening to it so much, because every listen reveals more of the album to you. Like, every listen, still, I've heard this album like must be close to 10 times in total now. And I'm still unlocking shit, so much shit all the time. And the fucking war of Moog violence, as I wrote down, that this song ends in, where she just kind of starts fucking hands on the synthesizer, just kind of blitzing it, and it turns into this bassy rumble. That shit is like a fucking thunderstorm in audio form. And then I mean, I've barely even got into like the visuals that this record makes me picture when I listen to it. But like, there's such striking sound on this record, and I imagine everyone would have a different experience. But when I hear those kind of Moog craziness that happens at the end of the song, I picture like a thunderstorm in my mind. And I mean, when you think about like the title of the album, Aviary, like an enclosure of birds, right? If you've ever been to an aviary, in the city I live in, we have like this massive aviary in this huge park in the center of my home city, and it's like huge. And if you go to it, the birds are just everywhere, and it's a cacophony of bird sounds, and they're all flying around.
They just make so much noise.
They make so much noise, and they're beautiful and ugly in some ways at the same time. And they're just all these different amorphous shapes moving around and just kind of like doing shit.
Nature's terrifying.
Yeah, and you do. But even though all of these birds are enclosed and you're, safe from, it's not going to be a Hitchcock situation, you become conscious.
I'm afraid that Julia Holter is going to hurt me.
You become conscious of like how vulnerable you are to the fucking wide world of nature. And then that's, again, one of the complex aspects of I think what Julia is going for with that album title and with the sound of the record, is like being both in harmony within a part of the world around you and all the beauty that it contains, but also kind of like awed and terrified by it all. Like it's the entire emotional experience of being alive.
The difficulty for me in describing this album is that it is so much one movement, and with clearly defined sections, but breaking any part of that one movement apart into individual pieces to talk about substantially it's difficult, because they're basically just so much as one is so much as good as the other that it basically becomes a little fruitless for me to separate them to that degree.
Well, which is why, though, that I think that maybe this album, it has a gestation period with people. At least, I mean, with the three of us, I certainly think that it has, because, at first it was like, yeah, this is great, but also like, I'm not done with this. And it's different from like a way that like, you compare it to other big albums, you compare it to something like Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness, for example, which is an album that I personally, I know all three of us love that album, but I love that album a whole lot. But that album too is, it is a collection of stellar songs, and that is sequenced basically perfectly. It has like, I think we once mentioned that that's an album where it has filler on it, but the totality of the album is so good and so all-consuming that it doesn't really matter. Well, this is almost in stark opposition to something like that, is because I, like Morgan, if you break it down into individual movements and you start to describe them, you can only do so with great difficulty, but also it just fails to consider the enormity of what you're listening to. And that's the part of like, is learning to process this as one big song, is that's sort of the journey you have to go on. And it takes a while. You have to sit down and you actually have to pay attention and like notice all of the things that are happening, because, you can write it off as it's all very, very pretty noise. It's very interesting noise. It's all engaging noise. But I mean, Tyler's already said it best when he's describing the individual songs on the first part of the album, is that there is just so many instruments that are all happening at the same time. There is rarely a moment where I think you can isolate less, like three or less things that are happening at the same time, and not even they're like happening irrespective of each other. They always feel like they're happening in a synthesis, which is why this album is so fucking amazing is that it always feels like everything is in relation to one another. It's like a living organism where it's just no part of it feels like it happens in a vacuum. There's no part of it where, like, you know, you can have some songs on an album that just, you know, like, oh, I like these more than the other, where it's like, I'm not really like that with this. It's just, you know, you give names to the specific movements, but there's definitely like specific emotional reactions I have to it. Like the first half of the album to me is really wondrous and exciting and like stimulating on a really raw level, and like it's not all slower, but the second half for me is really more like, I feel like I'm being cocooned. There's something that's distinctly a bit more peaceful and intoxicating about it. And it's not like it's exclusively made up of, like, it's not like a first half, second half Hounds of Love kind of deal. It's purely in like, I have these songs rated not in how good I think they are, but in like how I respond to them emotionally. It's why that, like, technically speaking, like, I mean, you know, I don't think anybody's gonna get on my ass considering what I'm going to give the album, but like, it's why technically Every Day is an Emergency is my least favorite song. It's because it thoroughly fucking unnerves me. It's because that song is really effective, and it's like, I don't necessarily like enjoy it, but it's the same way that I don't enjoy something like, you know, any given terrifying scene from 2001 A Space Odyssey, where you're just like, oh god, I'm repulsed. It's like it has its own almost visual, like Tyler sort of alluded to the fact that it conjures images in your brain, and you know, I feel like we're kind of predisposed to do that. We do that a lot with stuff like Autechre. Tyler and I did an entire review of Burial back in the day, where that entire compilation was basically us just doing that. But this is almost that to its most maximal effort, is that this is music that almost extends beyond being just a musical experience for me, which sounds like hyperbolic, but it's true. I'm sitting there and I'm laying in bed and I'm listening to this, and I literally need to turn off the lights in my room because any other sensory information is something that will muddle this experience to me.
That's a really good way of describing it. It's like a sensory experience. I think Connor, our friend, described Confield by Autechre in this way, where it's like most music engages your auditory senses, but that's a record that for him feels like it's engaging all 5 of his senses somehow, despite just being an auditory experience. And I think that's even truer of Aviary. It's a record that 100%. Is so thoroughly dominating of your entire kind of consciousness while it's on, that it's very difficult to do anything else. It just completely sucks you in and absorbs you. And that's something that's really struck me about listening to it this week, is not only how much I've wanted to listen to it, which surprised me a lot, but how even when I throw it on, it's a 90-minute album, and at no point do I want to do something else. I just want to sit there. And I just want to sit there. And I don't mean like turn it off and do something else. I mean, I don't want to like do something else while I'm listening to it. I just want to sit there and like take it in, which is like, you know, a very rare quality for an album of this length, right? Because it's demanding, but at the same time, it feels like it's giving you as much as it's demanding from you. And that's beautiful. Like, and that way I almost feel like I have a relationship with this album, not in a typical sense, but like in a sense that when I put this on, it's communicating with me and I'm communicating with it. And I don't care how dumb that sounds. That's how it feels when you're listening to this. It feels like somehow, and it's not that I'm communicating with Julia even, it's just that I'm communicating with this world, or I am like becoming a part of this world, or I'm like seeing myself in this new place, and it becomes this virtual reality experience almost. Fuck, I don't give a shit how weird it sounds to describe it this way. It's just like that.
Yeah.
And
it feels like I am going somewhere when I listen to this album. And that's why it's like, what I'm saying is this is the best album ever made. But I mean, kind of, but like, I can't stress enough how much I agree with what Tyler just said, to the extent where it's just like every fucking second of this episode where we are talking about the music, I'm just like, oh god, I want to fucking listen to the album right fucking now. Like, I don't, it's, and even still, it's like Morgan just absolutely exuding enormous dick energy. I simply cannot fathom like I'm at a point where I'm just so in love with the intoxicating experience as a whole that I'm just like, it's one of those albums that I just picture myself listening to 20 years from now and just being as thoroughly enamored with it as I am currently. And I just, I want to, I can't stress enough how I need to listen to this album on vinyl. I need it. I need to snort that. I need to distill that experience, and I need to crystallize it. I need it.
Morgan showed us his phone, and he was listening to this album. He was listening to Underneath the Moon, which is great because that is a song I wanted to talk about next. That's so good. It's hard to pick favorites, but this is a song that I think might be my favorite Julia Holter song. It's really close between that and another song later on this record, which we'll get to, and I'm sure entirely gush over. But this song is like the most animated the record gets. It's like a jazz fusion party. Like it literally, when Julia's spoken about the song, she's spoken about the song as being like an expression of her desire to dance and move and just completely lose herself in her body and just completely go nuts. And that's what she's trying to channel with the lyricism of this record, which refers to kind of like a sort of tribal landscape of like just inhibitionless dancing, and where you are not like consumed by or conscious of all of your neuroses or whatever. You're just able to be free. In fact, that's a theme I think Julia comes back to a lot on this record, is like being in a tense and difficult state and escaping that somehow, like being able to kind of transcend,
puts you in it to take you out of it.
Yeah. And so
I think that's pretty pervasive throughout her discography, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so many little details on this track I love, like the little melodies that the instrumentations are doing, just the heavily percussive element of the playing, the hysteria little vocal thing that she does that makes my brain melt. The organ on this track just fucking going nuts. It reminds me so much of Herbie Hancock's organ playing, because it's so like, like if you think, Jake, I know you love the Jack Johnson album, that album to me is like defined by Herbie's just dissonant organ playing, where he's kind of like hammering the organ. That sort of energy is
totally... It almost sounds like they don't know how to play it, but they're just like, I'm gonna fucking make this noise anyway, motherfucker.
Yeah, it's like a Farfisa on that album, and it might be on this too, I'm not 100% sure, but either way, it just sounds so like just crazy, and it's doing some nuts shit. I think, let me just check this, I think that it's Julia playing the organ as well, which, because you know, there's nothing this fucking woman can't do. Yeah, it is. Well done. So yeah, she's doing that shit. The double bass, again, I keep coming back to this double bass work from Devon. This shit is so fucking good. Like the double bass in general is such an underrated instrument, right? Because it's almost exclusively associated with jazz now, I think, because when most people listen to it, they're listening to it in the context of a jazz record. But it's such a dynamic, like rhythm section instrument. Like I would say it even has more dynamism than the typical kind of electric bass, because there's so much more you can do with it, which, you know, not to demean the electric bass, it's a very dynamic instrument, but the double bass is so like underappreciated now for the textures that you can get out of it. The trumpet on this track as well, I talked about Sarah Bell Reid's trumpet playing a lot, but my God, it's so fucking good and just trilling and swirling. It reminds me a lot of some of Miles Davis's playing, actually, and his kind of like classic sort of like late 50s, early 60s era. It just has that kind of tactile texture and just fiery feeling to it that Miles knows how to do. It's just a totally uninhibited song, and it's so like gorgeously celebratory. As a 1-2 punch off of the back of I Shall Love Too, it's like this transcendental heart of the album. And I Shall Love Too, incidentally, like I played that in the car the other day when I was driving to the movies, actually, to go and watch No Time to Die. Bond? No Time to Die. Yeah. That's right. I was playing this in the car on the way there, and I was just like, fuck.
That makes me think of fucking Have You in My Wilderness. One of my, just like the intonation she has on the line where she's like, I love going to the movies. And I'm just like, me too.
So true, Queen. Sing it. And then, yeah, I think, Jake, you're right. I like your description of the second half of the record as being sort of a bit more, I guess, a bit less kind of like crazy and a bit more sort of like subdued and like seductive is not the right word, but kind of like just like a blanket of sound almost.
Yeah,
With,
it's comforting.
Yeah, with one exception, which is the track I've already mentioned, Le Jeu to You, which is not comforting. It's fucking terrifying. But the rest of this second half of the album, if you like, is very like warm and enveloping in a way that the first half is mostly not, because it's so mostly like anxious. So in that sense, it almost feels like there's a progression in this album to a place of, you know, like a development where it's like starting in this place of chaos and moving to this place of peace. And I think that's reflected in something that Julia's said about the two different I Shall Love tracks, where it's like the second version, which is the one that appears first in the album, has I think more sort of tension to it. It's kind of more about a desire to escape sort of self-hatred and embrace like a defiant kind of love. And there's a tension in the arrangement. The conclusion is massive, but it's like kind of terrifying. Whereas this I Shall Love 1, which is the second version, which is kind of like the climax of this record, is much more, I think, euphoric and much more kind of like that love has been realized. Like it's kind of like an angelic choir of voices. And they just kind of beat that dun, dun, dun melody like into you again and again and again. And it feels like so amazingly triumphant, actually, in a way that very little other parts of the record have that sense of like triumph, like utter, just complete ecstasy, which makes it a really, really beautiful climax. I'm darting all over the place here, but that really stood out to me in terms when I was thinking about, okay, I wonder why Julia put two different versions of the same track on here. And then I saw her talk about, you know, the different ways in which those two songs capture different aspects of the same feeling of the desire to love both another person, like, but also to love oneself as well. I think that when she says that I am in love and I shall love too, and that when that happens, like when that song comes in and she leads off with that lyric, it feels so like naked and startling because it's such a simple sentiment on a record that has up to that point been so littered with like abstract like words just being collided together and like can't make heads or tails of what she's on about. And then you get to that track and she's just like, I am in love, and it's like, fuck. It's like, damn.
Me too. Fuck.
Totally. College Year is this stunning pool of swelling string and bass parts. One of the most traditionally beautiful tracks here, I think, though still full of strange textures and details that wrinkle it and contort it into abstract shapes. I love the stately but heavy piano chords of Ingarden's Muteness. They just really resonate and they have this real strength to them. And the sentiment of the song of like being awake at 3 a.m. and looking at your sleeping partner and feeling like this kind of distance from them and wanting to kind of get inside their mind and see what they're thinking and how they're working. Like that's a sentiment I can relate to. And I think that is one of the most kind of emotionally forthright moments on the record too. And I like the way that Julia's sense of bubbling tension and anxiety gets, as the night goes on, gets reflected in the way in which this track gets more tense as it goes on. The piano changes from being these kind of like booming bass notes and chords to like these really tense kind of like stabbing piano sounds. There's this stuff she does in the second half of this track where she's just kind of like hitting a single high note on the piano over and over and over again. And it reminds me so much of what Jocelyn Pook did in the score for Eyes Wide Shut, where she does that.
Ooh,
and it sounds exactly the same. And
fuck.
And then the song just has a sort of thunderous ending and it's great. You have, not that I haven't talked about amazing instrumentation enough, but Julia plays the harmonium on this record in multiple points, and most notably in the track I Would Rather See, which is a harmonium driven song, and it just sounds so good. The harmonium is so fucking like, it's an instrument you don't really hear enough, and it comes in and at the start of I Would Rather See. And one of my favorite little production details of the whole record is when this happens at the start of this track, you hear this distant cuckoo, cuckoo of a bird, like really far back. And every time I listen to this album, as soon as this track starts, I think there's a dog barking like outside of my house in the distance. And I'm like, wait, no, that's in the song, and it's not a dog, it's a cuckoo. And it's just like, again, it evokes that aviary image, and it evokes that nature image without like being too in your face.
It's also mixed to make you feel like you're like, I think part of the beauty of how the record is produced is that it's like it's produced like you are hearing it within your actual physical space, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely 100%. I talked about Les Jeux to You, which again is just nuts. It's a collision of radiant synths, jaunty piano chords, a surreally reverbed drum machine loop, like one of many examples of.
Is that what that is?
I think so, because there's a drum machine. There's a drum machine credit on this track, and I think this is just one example of like Julia will do some random shit that makes no sense whatsoever, and
go off.
And she'll make it like fit in the fabric of the thing that she's doing. And yeah, this track has that kind of ebb and flow of like craziness to like dead silence in Julia's voice to craziness again that she's able to do. And even though like the one part of this record that used to not work for me until very recently was the second half of this track, where all the vocals are all cut up and like just stretched and squealed.
I love that.
And I've come to love it as well, but it took some time to grow on me. And I like this is another thing where Julia said something that really like made the song click for me. And it's like what she's doing is a kind of celebration of human noise, like a celebration of words and speech and the human voice and everything you can do with it. She's just literally saying words.
It's like medulla condensed to half a track.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's a great reference point, actually. Bjork's Medulla is such a similar sort of record in terms of energy, at least.
Yep.
And this song really like has that, where it's like you're just doing shit with her voice for the sake of it, for the joy of like making sound. And again, that's a whole like thing that I said earlier, that the whole record is really like boils down to me is like the joy of being able to like make
Aviary is a concept album about how fucking rad music is.
100%.
I mean, we said
put it on the poster.
We said it earlier in this podcast, just like I think it was Tyler said something like, it just seems like this album's only goal is to just kind of sound this way for the sake of it. And it's like fucking, I mean, what was Bitches Brew? Like,
you're so fucking right.
Yeah, and Bitches Brew is a great comp. I made that comp on Twitter earlier this week, and it's like they exist in a similar space in the sense that even though they're quite different in terms of sound, they have a similar sort of like radical approach to like the way instruments are used, the way instruments play together, the way that compositions and improvisation is like comes together within a record. Like it's and they're both these kind of monoliths that you kind of just have to absorb and listen to again and again and again to start processing what the different players are even doing in those records, especially when the pieces get into their length and they start getting really, really dense. And yet it's always a joy to listen to Bitches Brew because it never gets boring or tired. It's always like invigorating, just like this record is.
I feel like the trajectory is pretty similar too, because like I feel like both In a Silent Way and Have You in My Wilderness are records where it's like, okay, I have figured out music. I've perfected it. And for this next piece, we're just gonna fuck around with some shit. We're just gonna see what happens.
Yeah. I would even say like maybe a more
fucking around, finding out.
Maybe a more apt comparison for the Miles heads out there is this is kind of maybe more like Get Up With It, which is like a 2-hour record where like ostensibly Miles' last studio record of his like fusion era. And it is like a record where motherfucker essentially just throws everything at the wall and just says
he makes fusion that's so fusiony it becomes ambient music.
Well, yeah, I mean, He Loved Him Madly is like a 30-minute ambient revolutionary piece, and it feels like it's not about the constant intensity the way that Bitches Brew is. It's about ebb and flow a bit more, and I think that aligns maybe with Aviary's sort of state of mind as well, because with Aviary the gentleness is just as important as the ferocity, whereas something like Bitches Brew, which is still comfortable in a lot of ways, is a much more consistently ferocious album. Words I Heard.
Yeah. Yes. I agree.
Preach.
I don't know what to say. I've got one thing I want to say, which is that this song has my favorite instrumental part of this whole album, and it is the dual violins. So a lot of this,
you're just putting that shit on.
A lot of this record has violin on it, usually just one violinist. This track has two violinists, Andrew Thole and Dina Maccabee. Just wanted to shout them out by name. And they are fucking the song. Like they're literally they're making love to the.
I mean, it is violin pornography.
Yeah, I was reminded of, not necessarily in sound, but just kind of impact. And I don't know if this will mean anything to either of you, but there's like a track on the Fishman's live album 98. It's 1228, where like on the track You're a Mickey in the Air, where this violin part is just so transcendental that you leave your body because of how intensely beautiful it is. And this is like that, except there's two violins, and they're not even like the entire song. There's obviously a lot of other shit happening, but the violins are just weaving in and out of each other, are so just commanding that every time I listen to it now, that my attention is drawn to them, despite the fact that Julia is doing some incredible work with her voice on the song, as you would expect, and the piano lines, the way those two things, her voice and her piano, are kind of rising together in this sort of like gorgeous consonance. And then Devon Hoff's bass work is particularly amazing. It just feels like one of the most distilled pieces of sublime, stunning perfection on this entire record. It is, I mean, I could see this becoming my favorite Julia Holter track actually quite easily, because it feels like in some ways, if you were to boil down this record into a single track, it feels like this might be the most emblematic of the whole album, in the sense that it has this beautiful harmonious nature to it. Like everything is kind of like together, but also there's so much happening that it's also kind of chaotic as well, despite that being a bit of a contradiction. There's a lot happening in the song, and it's just never less than utterly gorgeous. It
gives me both this and the earlier track Caligari, I don't know that one. Both of those give me a very similar feeling to a lot of Yoko Kanno's work on Wolf's Rain, which is like is like the best original score ever composed.
Oh wow, that's you. I feel like I had that thought, but didn't remember that was what it was. And I was like, God, this reminds me of fucking something. And then I never figured it out. And you just put that fucking jigsaw into place, motherfucker.
Wow.
Yeah, it's I know for a fact that Tyler has not seen Wolf's Rain, and it doesn't matter. You just need to hear the score.
If it sounds like this,
yes.
Yeah, it's I want to openly weep. And I cannot express why. There's not any particular reason other than this sounds so good. It makes me happy to be alive to hear it.
Oh God, yeah, it's so much.
It's a great description of the joy of this album, and like why, probably something that explains why I've been so addicted to it this week. Another aspect of the song I just wanted to touch on in terms of like why it's so emblematic of the album is I kind of talked about if you want to apply a real sort of concept to this album, it's about like being in existing in the fucking world, gestures at hell world, and like being able to escape that, like find some kind of like transcendence and try and find some kind of
your
like
aviary, if you will.
Yeah. And this is a song that's kind of like about that, like even within the lyrics, right? Because she alludes to with the opening lines, frequent missile talk, slurping on the words I heard from the wretched zone. That's a kind of reference to like war and the ongoing wars that are happening and the threat of nuclear annihilation and stuff. And the rest of the song is about, I guess, trying to escape all of that, save our souls. And then it ends in this beautiful place where she just says, I love you in the city of man, over and over again. And I don't know what that means, but I get from the feeling of the song that it feels like a cry of
I simply embrace the mystery with this album.
Yeah.
I don't want to know because it's beautiful and I don't need to know.
Mia surmise, sir.
Yeah. And yeah, and then it goes into I Shall Love, which again, if you see words I heard as kind of like a just plea to escape the craziness of the world, then I Shall Love is that kind of defiance realized, as I mentioned earlier. And then Why Sad Song is just a beautiful ending that I love the melody of this track. I love the quiet place that it ends in. I love the way that melody loops and goes up and down, is harmonized by the piano. It ends with the record feeling at peace. And
it takes you back down to earth.
Yeah.
You feel like you've been floating in space the entire time and you've been looking at the cosmos exploding, and then you just flutter back down and end up where you started.
It's like the total inverse of the opening track of the album, right? Like that is the most maximal this record gets, and this closing track is the most minimal it gets. And
spiral.
You have, yeah, exactly, made it all the way in. And yeah, God.
What we're getting at here is that Julia Holter is a genius, and you need to listen to all of her music.
That is fact.
Yeah, throughout this week, I've been like, am I gonna give this record a perfect score? Or am I gonna?
Yes. Don't be silly.
I listened to it for the first time for this, and I was like, all right, how do I feel about this? And then the second it was over, I was like, fuck. Oh my God, this is one of my favorite albums ever now. Holy shit.
Yeah, and I've gotten to that place too. And
it made it into my top 20 this week. I just fucking listening to it, and I'm just
like, have you in my wilderness is top 20 for me, and now I'm just like, I think Aviary is a little better.
I think it is too. I think it's 90 minutes where there's not a single second where I'm listening to this where I'm not completely taken with it, and where I'm not completely.
It's like a 9 Inch Nails fucking The Fragile and the Downward Spiral thing, where it's just like, when I was younger, I think I appreciated the tighter the structure, and that I was just a little bit less willing to accept the unwieldiness. And now that I'm older, I just feel like I connect with something that's just like, no. What I'm actually going to do is take everything that made this previous thing perfect, and I'm going to expound upon it in ways that you didn't even know that you wanted. And it's like fucking fuck.
It's not even one of those albums where I'm like, I think it's a perfect record, but like in the sense that it's amazing, and so amazing I can overlook certain moments of it that aren't as amazing as others. No, it's just that level the whole way through. It's just that level the whole way through.
Yes.
For fucking 90 straight fucking minutes.
And so that's the peak. It's the pinnacle.
I think Julia may be a celestial being.
Yeah. This is like, she's one of those.
She's just one of those.
She's like
one of those.
The goddess of the art house. Like, she's
spare hand in marriage.
Right, Julia?
I have no prospects. This is all I have.
That's the sales pitch. I really love aviary. Please marry me.
You know what, man? It's her
Um,
fault that I sound this way.
okay, let's wrap it up then. Favorite tracks and ratings for Miss Holter. I'll go first this time.
Yeah, give me a minute.
My 3 favorite tracks are Underneath the Moon,
Mhm.
Words I Heard, and
Hmm.
oh god,
It's legit terror. Oh God.
Horror.
I literally can't pick between I Shall Love To, Turn the Light On, and Another Dream. They're tied for 3rd place. So fuck it.
Sure.
10 out of 10.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, my favorite track is Aviary. My least favorite track is ten out of 10.
All right. Well, my 3 favorite tracks are Another Dream, Underneath the Moon, and Words I Heard. Least favorite track. This is a perfect album.
Least favorite track, clip from The Green Knight. How could you ask me that? How could you ever ask me that?
Speaking of perfect things,
Least favorite track. How dare you get out of my house? You
play Get Out of
There's
My
the
House by
door.
Kate Bush.
stay away from me and my son. This album gets an average of what do you think of Julia Holter's Aviary? Can you add to our inane babbling on the brilliance of this record in any way? Please, if you can, do, because I want to hear from you. We want to hear what you think and what you take away from the experience that this record is. Is it your favorite Julia record? What are your favorite Julia records and songs? Let us know all your Julia Holter takes in the comments below. Next week's Record Club is going to be on the Dismemberment Plans Emergency.
Also pretty cool.
Which is also, spoiler alert, a pretty good album.
What?
You could say.
What the fuck?
But also this week we have a 1991 retrospective on Teenage Fan Club's Bandwagon You Don't Want to Miss, as well as a main episode that went up 2 days ago on Little Ugly Maine and The World is a Beautiful Place and I Am No Longer Afraid to Die that you want to check out too. Make sure if you enjoyed the video, you like and subscribe if you have not already. Every single person who does that, especially the likes as well and the comments too, because I know a lot of you watch are probably already subbed. If you're not, please do. But make sure you like and leave a comment as well, because that really helps us with the algorithm stuff.
Road to 2K begins now, baby.
Oh yeah, the grind never stops. But yeah, that's basically
Another day, another dollar. Let's get this motherfucking bread.
Absolutely.
What is happening
right.
to my brain?
Glorious, what it is.
I feel like the fucking Brundlefly, except I'm just losing my mind instead of becoming a fly.
All right, everybody. Rock over London. Rock on Chicago. Panera Bread. Food as it should be.